She just stopped by a roadside cafe for a cup of coffee. Two police officers thought she was nobody and decided to mock her right in front of everyone. They shaved the elderly woman's hair, laughing and filming it on their phones. But just a few minutes later, the door opened and her son walked in. Chuck Norris. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where in the world you're watching this video from. The first light of dawn touched the edges of the sleepy Texas town like a painter brushing gold across faded canvas. The sun had only begun to rise when Helen Norris unlocked the front door of her small roadside cafe, the one she'd owned for nearly 40 years. The door creaked as it always did, its little brass bell chiming a familiar welcome that echoed through the still air. "Good morning, sweetheart," she murmured to the room, as though greeting an old friend. The diner, with its checkerboard floor and red vinyl booths, smelled faintly of coffee and yesterday's pie. Helen inhaled deeply, as if the scent itself gave her strength. Helen was small and wiry, her movements deliberate but graceful. Age had taken some of her speed but none of her presence. Her silver hair, once auburn and full, was now drawn into a careful bun, a crown of quiet dignity. Her hands, though lined and spotted, still moved with certainty as she adjusted the blinds, straightened napkin holders, and polished the counter until it gleamed. Outside, the street was just beginning to stir, an engine starting, a dog barking somewhere down the block. It was a town like many others in Texas, where people greeted each other by name, and the diner's coffee was more reliable than the post office. She turned on the old jukebox near the window, the one that hadn't been updated since the 70s. The soft hum of Patsy Cline filled the space, blending with the gurgle of the coffee machine. Helen smiled to herself. The same tune had played the morning her son left home all those years ago, carrying little more than a duffel bag and a promise that he'd make something of himself. Chuck had done more than that. Sometimes strangers who passed through the diner would glance at her name tag, notice the resemblance, and ask with disbelief, "You're his mother?" She would just nod politely, never adding more. Fame belonged to him, not her. By 6 o'clock, the first regulars began to trickle in. Joe Harkins, a truck driver with a permanent sunburn, claimed his usual corner booth. He waved two fingers toward Helen without needing to speak. She poured his coffee automatically, setting down a plate with 2 scrambled eggs and a biscuit before he even opened his mouth. "Morning, Miss Helen," he said, the words muffled by a yawn. "Morning, Joe. Roads treating you fair?" "Same as ever. Too long, too dusty, not enough pay." He grinned and sipped his coffee. "But your eggs make it bearable." By 7, the diner hummed softly with conversation. The local school teacher grading papers between sips of tea, a pair of old farmers arguing about weather reports, and 2 teenagers in greasy uniforms eating before heading to the gas station across the street. Helen moved among them like a conductor, her every step setting the rhythm. She never hurried, yet everything happened exactly when it should. She liked mornings best before the day could sour. Mornings were full of small courtesies, people saying thank you, opening doors for each other, nodding in passing. They reminded her of a time when dignity wasn't something to be defended but simply lived. Yet lately she had begun to notice a change in the air, a roughness, an impatience that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the town, it was the world. People seemed louder, meaner, too eager to remind others of their power. Helen had seen it most clearly in the way some of the new police officers treated ordinary citizens. They were young, cocky, and full of swagger, strutting through diners and grocery stores like they owned them. The older deputies were gone, retired or transferred, and these new men filled the void with arrogance instead of service. Still, she refused to let bitterness take root. She ran her diner the same way she always had, with warmth, fairness, and the simple belief that decency could survive if enough people practiced it. Around 8 o'clock, the morning crowd began to thin. The school bell would soon ring, the farmers would head to their fields, and the diner would settle into its late morning calm. Helen refilled the sugar jars and hummed quietly under her breath, thinking about calling her son later that evening. It had been months since they'd spoken. He called often when he could, though their conversations were short. He'd always been protective of her, even as a boy. The bell above the door chimed again, this time sharper, breaking her thoughts. 2 police officers walked in, boots clicking against the tile, uniforms crisp and freshly pressed. They carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came not from purpose, but from habit. The first tall, broad-shouldered, with mirrored sunglasses still on despite being indoors, nodded toward her as though granting permission for her to speak. The other, younger, blonde and wiry, followed him like a shadow. "Morning, officers," Helen said evenly, setting down her towel. "Coffee?" "Black," said the taller one, removing his glasses and sliding into a booth with the unhurried entitlement of someone accustomed to obedience. His partner grinned. "Make it 2, he said, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin tighten. "Smells good in here. You do all the cooking yourself?" "I do," she replied, refusing to rise to the tone. "Breakfast specials, eggs, sausage, and toast. I'll bring you a menu." "We don't need one," the tall one said. "Just the coffee, maybe something sweet." His smile was thin. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Helen," she said simply. "Nice place you got here, Helen." He looked around the diner, eyes landing briefly on each customer, who suddenly found reasons to stare at their plates. "Real homey," the younger one chuckled, leaning back in the booth. "Reminds me of my grandma's kitchen. Bet you run a tight ship, huh?" "I try to keep things decent," Helen said, placing their mugs on the table. "Most folks appreciate that." "Most folks," echoed the blonde one, smirking. "But not all, I guess." Helen felt the tension ripple through the air. The older officer, his name tag read. Royce lifted his cup, took a sip, then set it down with a loud clink. "You ever get inspections out here?" "Once a year," she said. "Maybe we should move it up," he muttered, half to himself. "Place looks clean, but you never know. Health code's tricky these days." Helen straightened slightly. "You gentlemen here for breakfast or business?" The younger one laughed. "Relax, ma'am. We're just talking." Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes hardened. "Then talk kindly." For a moment no one moved. The jukebox hummed quietly in the corner, the soft strain of a country song hanging in the air. Then Royce leaned back, stretching lazily. "You hear that, Miller? The lady wants us to talk kindly." "Guess we've been told." Miller snorted. "She's feisty for her age." Helen turned away before they could see the hurt flash across her face. She busied herself behind the counter, refilling a sugar jar that didn't need refilling. The room had gone heavy, the earlier warmth replaced by a nervous quiet. The customers avoided looking at her or the officers. Joe Harkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, muttering something under his breath. Royce's voice carried easily. "You know, Miller, my grandma used to say respect had to be earned. Guess not everyone got the memo." Helen set the sugar jar down with a little more force than necessary. "Respect goes both ways, officer." "Yeah, sure it does," he said, smiling without warmth. "But only one of us here's got a badge." The words hung in the air like a dare. Helen didn't answer. She turned to the coffee machine, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. It wasn't fear exactly. It was anger, the kind that came when cruelty disguised itself as authority. She'd seen it before in her younger years, in people who mistook uniform for virtue. The worst kind of power was the kind that demanded obedience instead of earning respect. Royce rose from his seat and strolled toward the counter. He picked up a napkin holder, inspected it as if it might be contraband. "You polish this every day?" "Every morning," Helen said. He nodded, setting it down deliberately. "You must have a lot of time on your hands," Miller laughed. "What else you gonna do? Knit sweaters for ghosts?" The remark drew a few uneasy chuckles from the tables, the kind that weren't laughter but self-preservation. Helen felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell them to leave, to shout that they were a disgrace to the badge they wore. But she also knew how quickly anger could be turned against her. "Gentlemen," she said finally, her tone firm but level, "I think you've had enough coffee." Royce's expression changed. The easy smirk vanished, replaced by something colder. "Is that right?" She nodded. "Yes, you'll need to find breakfast somewhere else." Miller whistled softly. "You hear that? The old lady's kicking us out." Royce leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You sure you want to do that, ma'am? Folks might say you're being uncooperative." Helen met his gaze without flinching. "Folks might also say I'm standing up for myself." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the low murmur of the jukebox. Then Royce straightened, forced a laugh and motioned toward the door. "Come on, Miller. Let's leave the lady to her dishes. We wouldn't want to break a nail." Miller followed, tossing $1 on the counter as they went. "Keep the change, Grandma." When the door finally closed behind them, the diner seemed to exhale. Conversations resumed, but quietly, cautiously, as if everyone was afraid the officers might come back. Helen stood for a long while staring at the dollar bill on the counter. Then she picked it up, folded it in half, and dropped it into the tip jar. "Coffee's on me today," she said softly. No one argued. Outside, the sun climbed higher, bright and indifferent, shining down on a world that had just tilted slightly darker. Helen wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the window, where a dusty road stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, her son was probably awake too, maybe teaching a martial arts class, maybe just taking a quiet walk before the day began. She wondered if he still prayed in the mornings, as he used to when he was a boy. She wondered if he ever sensed when she needed him. The bell above the door jingled again as a new customer entered, and she turned with her practiced smile, though her heart was still heavy. She didn't know it yet, but the next time those officers returned, the day would not end with uneasy silence. It would end in humiliation, violence, and justice, arriving with the quietest footsteps she'd ever heard. Outside, the wind stirred the dust along the road leading to town, whispering the faint promise of change. The diner returned to its rhythm, the jukebox starting another old song. Helen poured another cup of coffee, unaware that somewhere beyond the fields and the highway, her son Chuck had just looked up from his morning training, pausing for reasons he couldn't explain, as though he'd heard something calling from far away. The day moved on, calm on the surface, but waiting, just waiting for the storm that was already on its way. The next morning dawned with the same golden quiet that had graced every sunrise over the little Texas town. But for Helen Norris, it carried an unease she couldn't shake. She had slept poorly, waking again and again with the echo of rough laughter in her ears, the memory of mirrored sunglasses and cruel grins hovering in her mind. When she finally rose before dawn, the familiar ritual of preparing the cafe, turning the key in the door, polishing the counter, measuring the coffee brought her only half the comfort it usually did. Something in the air felt restless, charged, like the pause before a summer storm. By 7, Helen's diner was again alive with the rhythms of small-town life. Joe Harkin sat in his booth, stirring sugar into his coffee and talking about fuel prices with a young mechanic. Miss Cora, the schoolteacher, flipped through her papers and occasionally glanced at the door, wary since yesterday's incident. Everyone had seen the 2 officers come in. Everyone had watched them taunt and test Helen's patience. Yet no one had spoken up. This morning, that silence hung in the air heavier than the smell of baking grease and black coffee. Helen moved between tables with her usual grace, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. Each clang of the bell above the door made her chest tighten. She told herself the men wouldn't come back, that bullies like them rarely risked a second encounter with dignity, but she didn't believe it. And when the bell finally did ring, the sound sliced through the chatter like a blade. The same 2 uniforms entered. Royce, the tall one, with that permanent half-smile that never reached his eyes, and Miller, younger, thinner, his arrogance compensating for insecurity. They walked in as if the place belonged to them, their boots tapping in sync. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume, as though the air itself had grown cautious. Helen straightened her back and greeted them evenly. "Good morning, officers." "Well, look who's cheerful today," Royce drawled. "Guess there's no hard feelings about yesterday." "No hard feelings," Helen replied softly, though she could feel the eyes of every customer on her. "Would you like some coffee?" "Sure," said Miller, "and maybe a little more respect this time." He laughed, elbowing Royce, who chuckled as if on cue. Helen turned away to fill their cups, her shoulders rigid. Behind her she could hear them whispering, their voices low but deliberately audible enough to sting. "Guess she's still got some fight in her," Miller murmured. "Must be all those years bossing around truckers and farmers." "She's just lonely," Royce said. "Old folks get mouthy when no one listens at home." Helen set the cups down on their table and met Royce's gaze. "Coffee's hot. Try not to burn your tongues." For a moment he seemed taken aback by the edge in her tone. Then he smirked. You got spunk, lady. I'll give you that. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But you might want to remember who keeps this town safe. Safe, she echoed quietly, her jaw tightening. That's a fine word. Maybe you should try living up to it. The younger officer laughed out loud, startling the room. She's got claws, Royce. Watch yourself, Miller, Helen said sharply. You're talking to a woman older than your mother. He grinned. Probably tougher, too. The remark brought a ripple of nervous laughter from a corner table, the kind of laughter people use to hide their fear. Helen felt the sting of humiliation more keenly than she expected, not for herself, but for the people around her, neighbors who looked away rather than speak. She turned to wipe the counter, breathing slowly, willing herself not to tremble. Royce stood and began pacing the diner, glancing at the inspection certificates on the wall, the A rating from the county health office. He tapped the frame with a finger. This up to date? It was renewed last spring, Helen said, not turning around. Maybe we ought to double check. You'd be surprised how many violations get missed. She faced him now, her voice steady. You'd be surprised how many decent people get tired of being bullied. Royce's eyes hardened. You saying we're bullies? I'm saying you should drink your coffee and leave folks in peace. The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, a truck rumbled past, the sound of its engine fading quickly. Inside, time seemed to slow. Royce's lips curled in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You really think you can talk to an officer like that? I just did. For a long second, the two stared at each other, predator and prey, though neither looked away. Helen felt her pulse in her throat. Then Miller stood, stretching theatrically. You know, Royce, maybe she just needs a reminder about authority. Royce's grin widened. Maybe she does. He looked around the diner, noting how every customer had gone still, heads down, eyes fixed anywhere but the confrontation. Everybody here seems mighty interested in their plates, he said loudly. Guess no one's got much to say. No one answered. Even Joe, the trucker who had always defended Helen, sat frozen, his eyes darting between her and the officers. Royce took a step closer to her, close enough for her to smell the sharp tang of aftershave and sweat. Tell you what, ma'am, how about a little good-natured fun? Miller here's been saying your hair's something special, all silver and shiny. Real classic. Helen's heart skipped. Excuse me? Miller chuckled. Yeah, like something out of a museum. Royce turned toward the counter, where an old barber's kit sat on the shelf belonging to her late husband, who had once given free trims to customers in the back room. He picked it up, holding the electric clipper between two fingers. You still use this thing? Her voice caught. That's not a toy. Sure looks like one. He flicked the switch. The sharp buzz filled the room. How about a haircut, Grandma? On the house. The diner fell into utter silence. Someone whispered, Don't, but too softly for him to hear. Helen stepped back, shaking her head. That's enough. Miller moved around her, blocking the aisle. Oh, come on, don't be like that. We're just having fun, lighten up. You're in uniform, she said, her voice trembling now with fury more than fear. You think this is funny? You think humiliating a woman makes you men? Royce smiled lazily, closing the space between them. It's not about funny, ma'am. It's about respect. You embarrassed us yesterday, made us look weak. Can't have that. Helen's back hit the counter. You're making a mistake. Maybe, he said, but you'll remember it. He reached out, grasped a lock of her hair, and before she could move, the buzzing sound filled the air again. The first strand fell. Gasps broke from the tables. Stop, she cried, but the word was drowned by laughter. Miller's high-pitched giggle, Royce's low snicker. The humiliation was unbearable, but she refused to scream. She stood rigid, her fist clenched, her jaw tight as her silver hair drifted to the floor. Hold still, Miller said mockingly. You'll look years younger. When he was finished, Royce stepped back, surveying his work with satisfaction. The once proud bun was gone, replaced by uneven patches of white scalp gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He ran a finger over the back of her head and laughed. There. Now you look like one of us, part of the force. Helen didn't move. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. Inside, a war raged between shock and rage, between the need to collapse and the instinct to stand taller. She whispered, "You will answer for this." Roy shrugged. "To who? You gonna call your friends? Maybe your son? What's he gonna do, write us a letter?" The mention of her son struck like a spark in dry brush. She said nothing, only lifted her chin and met his gaze with an icy calm that made him hesitate for the first time. "Get out," she said quietly. For a moment it seemed he might laugh again, but something in her eyes stopped him. He turned, motioned to Miller, and together they walked toward the door, still chuckling, though uneasily now. When the door closed, the diner remained frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Helen took a slow breath and reached for a napkin, wiping at the tears she hadn't realized were falling. Strands of silver clung to her apron, to the counter, to the floor. She looked around at the faces of her customers, neighbors, friends, silent witnesses, and saw only guilt. Joe finally stood, his voice rough. "Miss Helen, She stopped him with a small gesture. "No, Joe, don't. Please." He sat down again. Helen gathered the fallen hair into her hands and dropped it into the trash. Her movements were mechanical, detached. The weight of what had happened pressed on her chest, but she wouldn't break here. Not in front of them. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, but so quiet that it silenced even the whispers. "They think they took something from me," she said, "but all they did was show what they are." She removed her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Then, with deliberate grace, she walked to the door and locked it, flipping the sign to closed. Outside, the officers' laughter echoed faintly as their cruiser pulled away. The sound drifted through the still morning like a ghost. Helen leaned against the door for a moment, her heart pounding. She felt the sting of cold air against her scalp, the humiliation of exposure. But beneath it all, deeper than the shame, something else stirred. Something harder, older, forged from years of quiet strength. She went into the back room, turned on the sink, and washed her face. When she looked up, the mirror showed a stranger. An old woman with a shorn head and eyes that no longer held softness, but a fierce, unyielding light. She reached up and touched her scalp, feeling the roughness of the uneven cut. The reflection didn't make her flinch. "They can take hair," she whispered to her reflection, "but not dignity." She didn't yet know that miles away, in a quiet ranch outside of Dallas, her son was sitting at his kitchen table, reading the morning news when his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend in town. It contained only one line and a photograph, the front window of Helen's diner, the words "Closed today," written in trembling black marker, and through the glass the faint reflection of an old woman sweeping silver hair from the floor. Chuck stared at the photo for a long time. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, as if waking from a long stillness. He reached for his jacket, his keys, and the small wooden cross that hung by the door. The storm that Helen had sensed was no longer on its way. It had already begun to move. The day after the incident began quietly, as though the town itself wished to bury what had happened inside Helen's diner beneath a thick layer of silence. But silence, she knew, was only the air's way of holding its breath before the world exhaled truth. Helen opened her cafe that morning out of habit, not because she wanted to. The act of turning the key, of hearing the bell above the door ring, had always meant order and continuity to her. But now, that same sound cut through her chest like a blade. She had swept up every strand of her own hair the night before, cleaned the floors until her knuckles bled, but she could not clean away the humiliation. She had worn a headscarf tied tightly under her chin, though she could still feel the uneven stubble where her hair had once been. Her regular customers arrived one by one, moving as though they were stepping into a church after a funeral. They greeted her softly, uncertainly, their eyes flicking toward the scarf but never lingering. The smell of coffee filled the air again, but its comfort had been stolen. No one spoke of what had happened, not directly. It hung in the room, heavy and alive, like a secret no one dared name. Helen moved through her routine as best she could, her face expressionless, her voice quiet but steady. When Joe tried to tell her that everyone was talking about it around town, that the sheriff's office was pretending not to know, she only nodded once and said, "Let them talk." By mid-morning she was exhausted, her body aching from the weight of pretending she was fine. She stood behind the counter, staring out the front window at the stretch of road that shimmered in the Texas heat. The world outside moved on as though nothing had changed. A delivery truck passed. A group of teenagers laughed outside the grocery store across the street. And somewhere down the road, faint but growing louder, came the distant hum of a powerful engine. The bell above the door jingled, soft at first, then once more, firmer, as if struck by a gust of intention. The sound made her jump slightly. She turned, ready to greet whoever it was, and then froze. The man who stepped inside didn't need an introduction. Though the years had etched faint lines around his eyes and the hair at his temples had turned silver, his presence was unmistakable. Chuck Norris stood framed in the doorway, the sunlight behind him outlining his tall figure in gold. He wore a simple denim jacket, jeans, and boots still dusted from the road. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes were something else entirely. Sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime reading danger in silence. For a moment, no one in the diner moved. The customers recognized him instantly. Whispers rippled through the room like wind through grass. Chuck's gaze swept across the room, taking in every detail, the stillness of the crowd, the scarf on his mother's head, the way she gripped the counter to steady herself. Then his eyes landed on her, and the composure she had been holding on to all morning began to crumble. "Mom," he said quietly. Her lips trembled. "Chuck, you shouldn't have come." "I got the call," he replied, stepping closer. "You didn't think I'd stay away, did you?" Before she could answer, the bell rang again. The sound tore through the stillness like thunder. The two officers entered, Royce and Miller, their uniforms pressed, their faces smug. They didn't notice him at first. Royce removed his sunglasses, the metallic reflection catching the sunlight, and smirked as he spotted Helen behind the counter. "Well, if it isn't our favorite hostess," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Back to work already? Guess the new haircut didn't slow you down." Miller laughed. "Looks good on her, though. Real modern." Chuck didn't move. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but there was something about the stillness of him that made the air shift. He turned slightly, and when Royce finally noticed him, his grin faltered. There was a pause, just long enough for awareness to bloom in Royce's eyes. "Hold on," he said, his tone changing. "Ain't you?" "Yes," Chuck said simply. Recognition spread through the diner like fire catching dry grass. The silence became electric. Every breath held. Miller's laughter died in his throat. Royce tried to compose himself, straightening his posture. "Well, well," he said with forced nonchalance. "Didn't expect to see a movie star in our little town. You here filming something?" "No," Chuck said. "I'm here for my mother." Royce's smirk twitched. "Your mother?" He glanced at Helen, then back at him, and a flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "Oh!" The single syllable hung there, brittle and meaningless. Chuck's gaze never wavered. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, didn't posture. He simply looked at them, and that look carried more weight than any threat. "You touched her," he said, his tone soft but cold. Miller tried to recover the air of arrogance. "Hey, we were just having a little fun. Nobody got hurt. You know how it is. Folks around here take things too seriously." Helen took a step forward. "Chuck, don't." He lifted a hand gently to stop her, his eyes still on the officers. "Fun," he repeated. "You call humiliating an old woman fun?" Royce spread his hands. "Look, Mr. Norris, we didn't mean anything by it. Just a misunderstanding. That's all." "A misunderstanding is when someone trips over your foot," Chuck said quietly. "What you did was cruelty, and you did it while wearing the badge you swore to honor." Miller scoffed. "You don't get it, man. You don't live here. You don't know how we handle things." "I know exactly how men like you handle things," Chuck said, his voice now lower, the words deliberate and sharp as glass. "You hide behind a uniform. You use power to cover weakness. You think fear makes you strong. It doesn't." Royce took a step forward, puffing his chest as if to reclaim control of the moment. "You better watch your tone. You're talking to law enforcement." "I'm talking to cowards," Chuck said. The word dropped like a stone. The room went dead still. Miller's face turned red. "That's it!" he snapped, reaching for the baton on his belt, but he never had the chance to draw it. Chuck's hand moved in a blur, quick, precise, practiced, and the baton was suddenly in his grasp. No one had even seen him move. Miller staggered back, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. Royce reached for his gun, but Chuck's gaze froze him where he stood. "Don't," Chuck said, "not in front of her." The command in his voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority, the kind that could stop a storm. Royce's hand trembled, then slowly dropped away from the holster. The room remained suspended in perfect silence. Helen's voice, trembling but clear, broke through it. "Chuck, please. They're not worth it." He looked at her then, his expression softening for the first time. "They made you believe that," he said gently. "They made you think standing up for yourself isn't worth it. But it is." He turned back to the officers, his expression once again unreadable. "You're going to walk out that door," he said evenly, "and you're never going to come near her again. You're going to apologize here and now to every person in this diner who watched what you did. You're going to do it because it's right. Not because you're scared, but if you can't tell the difference, I'll help you understand." Royce swallowed. His throat worked as he looked around the diner, seeing every eye fixed on him. The customers who had once cowered now sat upright, faces hard. Joe rose from his booth, his fist clenched. "Do what he says," he muttered. Miller hesitated, his voice breaking as he said, I'm sorry." Royce shot him a furious glance, then realized resistance was pointless. He turned toward Helen, his voice low. "Sorry, ma'am." Helen stared at him for a long time. "You're not sorry for what you did," she said softly. "You're sorry you were seen." Royce said nothing. He and Miller backed toward the door, the weight of every gaze following them. As they reached the threshold, Chuck's voice stopped them once more. "Leave your badges on the table," he said. Royce froze. "What? You heard me?" For a second, the two men hesitated. Then, under the crushing silence, Royce unclipped his badge and placed it on the counter. Miller did the same. The metallic sound of them landing on the surface echoed like a gavel. Then they turned and left. The door closed behind them. The bell chimed, once bright, clear, final. For several long moments, no one in the diner moved. The tension that had strangled the air slowly began to dissolve. People exhaled, chairs creaked, someone began to clap quietly, then another, until the sound filled the room. Chuck raised a hand, motioning them to stop. "This isn't about applause," he said. "It's about remembering who we are, what kind of people we let ourselves become when we look away." He turned to his mother. "Come on, Mom, let's go home." Helen hesitated. "I can't just close up." "You can," he said, "just this once." She nodded slowly. Together they walked toward the door, and as they stepped outside, the sunlight struck her face. The scarf slipped slightly, revealing the bare skin beneath. Chuck reached out and adjusted it gently, his touch full of care, not pity. "You don't have to hide," he said quietly. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled faintly. "You came just in time." He looked back toward the diner's window, where the two badges still lay glinting in the light. "No," he said softly. "Right on time." As they walked down the quiet street, a breeze picked up, carrying away the last echoes of laughter that had once poisoned the diner. The bell above the door swung gently in their wake, ringing not as a sound of fear anymore, but as a promise, one that whispered of reckoning, of justice, and of the calm strength that comes when the storm has finally met its match. By the time the sun set that evening, the story had already begun to spread beyond the quiet boundaries of the small Texas town. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation inside Helen's diner. Every word, every glare, every moment from the entrance of the officers to the instant when they placed their badges on the counter and walked out under the weight of their own shame. Within hours, the video had appeared online, shared first by a local blogger and then reposted by strangers across the country. By dawn, millions had seen it. The sight of an elderly woman standing motionless with her son, recognizable to all, yet somehow more human in that instant than in all his movies, became a symbol that the news anchors could not stop talking about. But Helen herself knew none of this when she woke the next morning. For her, the world was small again. 4 walls, a kitchen, and the scent of brewing coffee that filled her modest home. Chuck had insisted she close the diner for a few days, but she couldn't. Habit was the one thing that held her together. The rhythm of ordinary work keeping her from collapsing into memory. When she arrived, the place looked exactly as they had left it, except for the 2 badges that still lay on the counter. She stood staring at them for a long time. Their shine had dulled overnight, and she noticed small scratches on the surface, like scars. She picked them up carefully, one in each hand, and placed them in a small glass jar beside the register. They no longer represented authority, only the fragility of it. Chuck had stayed in town, though she had begged him to return home. "It's over," she had said, "and I don't want you caught up in it." But he refused. "Mom, it's not over," he had answered quietly. "It's just starting. You know how men like them work. They don't lose gracefully." He was right. Before noon, the phone began to ring. The first few calls were from journalists, their voices eager, polite, rehearsed. "Mrs. Norris, we'd love to hear your side. Can we speak to your son? Would you consider an interview?" She hung up every time, her hands shaking slightly afterward. Then came the calls that weren't from journalists, the ones that hissed through the receiver in low, angry voices. "You think you can embarrass officers of the law?" one said. "Maybe you should keep that place closed for good." Another voice, colder, said, "You brought this on yourself. Should have known better than to mouth off." By the third call, Chuck had installed a new lock on the back door and moved his truck behind the building. He didn't tell her that he had already spoken to a friend in the FBI who specialized in internal investigations, but she could sense his vigilance. Whenever someone walked past the window, his eyes followed. When the phone rang, he was the one to answer. And when he left her side, it was only to step outside and watch the street. The sheriff finally showed up 2 days later, his hat in his hands, his expression uneasy. He was a man Helen had known for decades, a decent sort who believed in paperwork more than confrontation. "Helen," he began, "you have no idea what kind of trouble this has stirred up." "I didn't stir it," she said, her voice flat. "They did," he sighed. "I know, and believe me, there's going to be a full review. But the department's getting hammered from all sides. Folks upstate are calling it an embarrassment. The mayor wants it contained before it turns political." Chuck, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, asked quietly, "Contained how?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "They're saying it might be better if you didn't press charges, if we handle it internally." Helen laughed softly, a sound with no humor. "Internally," she repeated, "like sweeping dust under a rug?" The sheriff looked down. "You know how it works, Helen. The union, the paperwork, it's a mess." "Then let it be a mess," Chuck said. "Maybe that's what needs to happen." The sheriff's gaze flickered between them. "You're both making this hard for everyone?" Chuck's voice stayed calm. "It's supposed to be hard." After the sheriff left, Helen sat at one of the booths and stared out the window. The afternoon sun poured through the glass, painting everything in gold, but she felt no warmth. "I used to believe the law protected people," she said quietly. "I taught you that when you were little." Chuck sat across from her. "You taught me to protect people, Mom." "The law doesn't always do that." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but you're the reason I know which battles are worth fighting." That night, the diner's lights stayed on longer than usual. People began showing up after dark, not to eat, but to talk. Strangers who had seen the video online drove from nearby towns. A teacher brought flowers. A young woman cried quietly at the counter, saying her mother had once been humiliated by an officer just the same way. They told their stories, haltingly at first, then with growing conviction, as though the walls of the diner had turned into a confessional. Helen listened to them all, sometimes offering a word, sometimes just a cup of coffee. By midnight, when the last car had left, she sat alone with Chuck, staring at the empty tables. "It's strange," she murmured. "I always wanted this place to be about kindness. Now it's become something else." Chuck leaned back in his chair. "It's still kindness, Mom, just a louder kind." The next morning brought a different kind of visitor. 2 men in suits arrived, identifying themselves as investigators from the Department of Justice. They asked for statements, records, security footage, anything that might support an inquiry. Helen answered their questions carefully, though her voice trembled when she described the moment the clippers buzzed to life beside her ear. Chuck watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When the men left, one of them turned at the door and said, "Ma'am, you've started something important." But importance came with danger. That evening, a rock smashed through the diner's front window. The sound jolted Helen upright. Glass sprayed across the counter. Chuck ran outside, but the street was empty. Only the fading roar of a car engine echoed in the distance. He found the rock near the curb, wrapped in a scrap of paper. The words scrawled across it made his jaw tighten. "Stay quiet or next time we won't miss." Helen stood in the doorway, her scarf fluttering in the warm wind. "They're cowards," she said. He nodded, tossing the rock into the trash. "Cowards get brave when no one's watching. That's why we'll keep the lights on." She didn't argue. Together they swept the glass, replaced the pane with a temporary board, and opened again the next morning. Customers came despite the danger more than ever before. Someone had printed a photo from the video and taped it to the wall near the register. In it, Helen stood beside her son, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, both facing the camera. Underneath, someone had written in marker, "Respect has no age." The diner became more than a place to eat. It became a refuge. People brought donations, offered to repaint the front, to sit guard at night. Even the sheriff returned, hat in hand, his voice softer this time. "You've got the whole state talking, Helen. They're sending a federal team down here. The 2 officers are on suspension." "Suspension?" Chuck repeated. "That's all?" "For now," the sheriff said. "There'll be hearings. Maybe more." The following week crawled by in a blur of reporters, interviews, and letters. Some were kind, others vicious. One morning, a thick envelope arrived from a local veterans association. Inside was a single note. "What you did reminded us why we wore the uniform." It was signed by 20 names. Helen wept quietly as she read them, but the fear hadn't vanished. At night, headlights sometimes slowed outside her house, pausing too long before moving on. Once someone painted words on the diner's back wall: liar, traitor, attention seeker. Chuck scrubbed them off before she saw them, though she knew anyway. She had spent her life believing decency was stronger than cruelty. Now she understood the truth. Decency was not stronger by nature. It survived only when people defended it. One evening, she and Chuck sat outside the diner, watching the sunset. The air smelled of rain and dust. "You could leave," she said quietly. "Go home. You've done enough." He looked at her, his profile calm against the fading light. "You once told me that courage isn't about winning fights. It's about staying when it's easier to leave." She smiled faintly. "I said that?" He nodded. "When I was 13, the day I lost my first tournament." She laughed softly, then her expression turned thoughtful. "Do you ever get tired of fighting, Chuck?" "Every day," he said, "but I get up anyway." That night she dreamed of her youth of days, when her hair had been long and auburn, when her husband was still alive, when Chuck was a boy sitting at the counter doing his homework. In the dream, the diner was bright again, untouched by fear or cruelty. When she awoke, dawn was just breaking, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. The investigation moved swiftly after that. Evidence mounted, testimonies poured in, and by the end of the month, the case had drawn national attention. Royce and Miller were formally charged with abuse of authority, assault, and obstruction of justice. Their names filled the newspapers that once ignored the small town entirely. When reporters came asking for her comment, Helen gave only one statement: "I'm not seeking vengeance. I just want the world to remember what respect looks like." Chuck stood beside her during every interview, every court date, every long, exhausting hour of testimony. When she faltered, he steadied her. When she doubted herself, he reminded her what she had endured. And when the verdict finally came, when the judge pronounced both men guilty and ordered a full review of the department, she closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The town changed after that, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but truly. Officers began greeting people by name again. Strangers left flowers outside the diner. Parents brought their children telling them, This is where courage happened. Helen never saw herself that way. To her, she had simply done what any decent person should do: stand her ground, speak the truth, and refuse to let humiliation define her. One evening, long after the news vans had gone and the crowds had thinned, she locked up the diner and stood alone inside. The new window gleamed. The lights reflected softly off the counter she had polished 1,000 times. She opened the jar on the shelf and looked at the 2 badges resting inside. They no longer seemed menacing, only sad. Symbols of what happens when power forgets purpose. She screwed the lid back on and whispered, "Let it stay a warning." Outside, Chuck was waiting by the truck. He looked up at the night sky, his expression serene. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She smiled. "Almost. Just one more thing." She flipped the sign on the door to closed and lingered a moment, her hand on the glass. Through the reflection, she saw her own face lined, weary but unbroken. Then she turned to her son. "Let's go." They drove through the quiet streets, headlights cutting through the darkness. The town was asleep, but its heart was awake, pulsing with something: new respect, maybe, or hope. As they passed the courthouse, Helen glanced out the window and whispered, "It's over." Chuck's eyes stayed on the road. "No," he said softly, "it's beginning." The silence between them was peaceful, not the heavy silence of fear, but the quiet that follows a storm when the air is clear and every sound carries farther. The road stretched out before them, endless, bathed in moonlight. For the first time in weeks, Helen allowed herself to rest her head against the seat, close her eyes, and believe that dignity, once lost, once mocked, had finally found its voice again. The courthouse in the county seat had not seen a crowd like this in decades. Reporters lined the steps, their microphones angled toward the doors, their cameras feeding live to networks across the country. Local families gathered on the sidewalks with homemade signs that read, "Justice for Helen," and "Respect has no age." Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the blend of perfume, aftershave, and nervous sweat. The hum of whispers filled every corridor. Everyone wanted to see it, the moment when 2 police officers, once untouchable, would face the woman they had humiliated and the man who had made them kneel before decency. Helen arrived quietly, escorted by her son. She wore a simple dark blue dress and a short gray jacket. Her hair had begun to grow back in soft silver wisps, framing her face like a halo of new strength. The scarf was gone now. She refused to hide what had been done to her. When she stepped into the courtroom, the murmurs faded into a reverent silence. She did not look toward the defense table where Royce and Miller sat in their pressed suits, expressions stiff and rehearsed. She kept her eyes forward, walking with the calm dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. Chuck followed a step behind her. He wore a tailored black jacket, the kind he reserved for formal occasions, though his posture carried more quiet authority than any uniform could. When he placed his hand on his mother's shoulder, it wasn't for support, it was a promise. The judge entered, an older woman with a clear gaze and steady voice. "Court is now in session," she said. "This case concerns the charges of misconduct, abuse of authority, and aggravated assault against officers Royce and Miller." The prosecution began its opening argument with a tone of restrained outrage. The lead attorney, a woman named Rachel Cortez, spoke directly to the jury. "This case is not about fame," she said. "It's not about reputation. It's about power, how it is used, and what happens when those who hold it forget their duty to serve and instead choose to harm. What happened to Mrs. Norris inside that diner was not a prank. It was not a misunderstanding. It was an act of humiliation meant to remind a proud woman of her supposed place beneath the boots of men who thought themselves invincible." Royce's lawyer objected, muttering about dramatics, but the judge silenced him with a glance. The trial continued. Witness after witness took the stand, customers from the diner, townsfolk, even the sheriff himself. One by one, they described the same scene. The laughter, the buzzing of the clipper, the look on Helen's face as her hair fell to the floor. Some voices shook with guilt for not having intervened. Others trembled with anger for what they had seen. When the video from the security camera was finally played, the room fell completely silent. There was no sound at first, only the image. The officers towering over Helen, their faces twisted in amusement, the trembling of her hands, the motionless witnesses frozen in their seats. Then came the laughter, faint but unmistakable, captured in the grainy recording. Royce's voice, cruel and clear. "Now you look like one of us." The moment stretched endlessly. Even those who had seen the footage online held their breath as if watching it for the first time. When it ended, Helen's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. Rachel turned toward the jury. "You've seen it yourselves," she said softly. "No one forced them to act. No one provoked them. This was not a mistake. It was a choice." When it was time for the defense, Royce's attorney attempted to twist the story into one of misunderstanding and jest. He painted Royce and Miller as young men who had made a foolish mistake, claiming they had been caught up in a moment of ill-considered humor. He described Helen as a respected but strong-willed woman whose words may have escalated the tension unintentionally. The phrasing made Chuck's hands clench on the table. He wanted to speak, to shout that no words ever justified humiliation, but Helen laid a hand on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Let them talk. Truth doesn't need shouting." When the defense finally called Royce to the stand, the air turned cold. He walked slowly, his confidence eroded by weeks of public disgrace. His once proud posture seemed practiced now, forced. He spoke in a controlled tone, describing himself as deeply regretful. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said, eyes flicking briefly toward Helen. "It was stupid. I thought it was funny at the time. I was wrong." Rachel approached him for cross-examination. "Officer Royce," she began, "how long have you been in law enforcement?" 12 years. "Then you understand the meaning of restraint, correct?" "Yes." "And of respect?" "Yes." "So when you restrained an unarmed woman in her own diner and forcibly cut her hair, where were those lessons then?" He hesitated. "I lost control." "You didn't lose control," Rachel said. "You enjoyed control. You exercised it cruelly, and when you were caught, you called it a joke." Royce looked down, his mouth tightening. Miller avoided his gaze entirely. When Helen's turn to testify came, the room seemed to shift again. She stood slowly, walked to the witness stand, and took the oath. Her voice was steady, calm, but it carried through the room like a song carried by the wind. "I'm not here because I want revenge," she began. "I'm here because I want to live in a town where people remember what kindness looks like. I was humiliated that day, yes, but that's not what hurt most. What hurt was the silence, the people who sat and watched because they were afraid. I don't blame them. I understand fear, but we can't keep letting fear decide what's right." The judge leaned slightly forward. Even the court stenographer paused, her fingers stilling for a moment before catching up. "They took my hair," Helen continued, "but they didn't take my dignity. That's something you can only give away, and I won't give it to them. My son didn't come here to fight them. He came to remind them, and all of us, that decency still matters, that there's still a line between good and evil, and it's drawn not by power, but by conscience." A murmur spread through the courtroom, not of noise, but of feeling, an invisible wave of empathy. The judge cleared her throat softly and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Norris." When Helen returned to her seat, Chuck met her eyes. "You did it," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "No, son. We did." The rest of the trial unfolded quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony irrefutable. When the jury retired to deliberate, it took them less than an hour to return. The foreman, an elderly man in a plaid jacket, stood and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." The words seemed to echo through the room like a bell tolling the end of an era. Royce lowered his head, his jaw tight, while Miller sank into his chair, his face pale. The judge delivered the sentence with solemn clarity: 2 years imprisonment, probation, and mandatory dismissal from the force. "But more than that," she said, "this court hopes today serves as a reminder to all who wear the badge. Power without humility is tyranny." Reporters rushed to the steps outside, cameras flashing, microphones reaching for statements. Helen refused to speak until one reporter asked, "Mrs. Norris, how does it feel to finally see justice served?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Justice," she said, "isn't about punishment. It's about learning. If they walk out of prison better men than they walked in, then justice is complete. If not, then it's still waiting. Chuck placed an arm around her as they moved through the crowd. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning. People shouted her name, some crying, some cheering. For her, it was all distant noise. She was tired, not from the fight, but from the years it had taken to remember that courage could live quietly too. In the weeks that followed, changes swept through the town. The police department underwent review, new leadership was appointed, and community meetings were held in the diner every Saturday. Chuck helped organize self-defense classes in the same room where his mother had once served coffee and pie. The sheriff, humbled but determined, began working to rebuild trust between officers and citizens. The town, once fractured by silence, began to find its voice again. On a cool autumn morning, a letter arrived from the governor's office. It was an invitation for Helen to speak at a state conference on community integrity. She almost refused. She had never liked attention, but Chuck convinced her otherwise. "You've spent your life teaching people to be kind," he told her. "Now they're finally listening." At the conference, Helen stood before hundreds of people officers, judges, teachers, ordinary citizens, and told her story without anger. She spoke of weakness and strength, of how easily decency can die when left unguarded, and how simple it is to revive if someone dares to care. When she finished, the audience rose in a long, solemn standing ovation. She felt her cheeks flush, embarrassed by the noise, but when she glanced at Chuck in the front row, she saw pride in his eyes, not the pride of a son whose mother had become famous, but the pride of a man who knew she had remained herself. That night, as they drove home through the open plains, the stars stretched endless above them. "You know," she said, "I never thought my little diner would end up in the papers." Chuck laughed softly. "You didn't start a story, Mom. You reminded people how to end the wrong ones." She smiled at that. "I just wanted to make good coffee." "And you did," he said. "But sometimes good coffee starts revolutions." They both laughed, the sound light and genuine, carried away by the wind that swept through the open fields. The town lights glimmered in the distance like candles against the dark horizon. Somewhere behind them, in a courtroom that now stood empty, a verdict remained on record, a testament not just to punishment, but to awakening. When they finally reached the diner, the porch light still glowed. Helen paused before unlocking the door. "Do you think people will remember all this?" she asked. Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder. "They'll remember you." She turned the key and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of sugar and nostalgia. On the wall hung the photograph someone had taken the day after it all began, her and Chuck, side by side, standing in front of the broken window. Underneath, someone had added new words in careful handwriting. "Dignity is the quietest form of strength." Helen smiled, brushing her fingers across the frame. "Maybe that's enough," she whispered. Outside, the night was still and calm. Justice had been served, but more importantly, something deeper had been restored. The idea that even in the smallest towns, under the dimmest lights, truth could still rise like morning. And for Helen Norris, that was worth every scar, every tear, every strand of silver hair that had fallen to the floor. Autumn faded into winter, and with it the noise of the trial slowly dissolved into the quieter rhythm of everyday life. The cameras left first, then the reporters, then the curious visitors who had driven for hours just to sit in the diner that had become a national symbol. The bright lights, the interviews, the applause, all of it, drifted away like smoke, leaving behind the small, honest heartbeat of the town that had existed long before fame had touched it. Helen was grateful for that silence. Fame had never suited her. Peace had always been her language. And yet the peace that returned was not the same as the one she had known before. It was deeper, steadier, built from the ashes of struggle and the understanding that true calm comes only after a storm has spent itself. The diner looked different now, not because the walls had changed, but because of what they represented. There were new faces among the regulars, people from nearby towns, who had come to see the place where justice had found its footing. Some came quietly and sat at the counter without saying a word. Others brought letters or small tokens, notes of thanks, photographs of family, even medals from veterans who said her courage had reminded them of something they had nearly forgotten. Helen always smiled, always thanked them, but deep down she still felt uneasy about being called brave. I just didn't let them take what wasn't theirs, she would say. Her hair had grown back now, soft and silver, cropped short in a way that suited her more than she expected. It framed her face like a crown of quiet resilience. Sometimes when she caught her reflection in the diner window, she smiled faintly. There was no trace of shame left, only the memory of endurance. People noticed the change in her eyes most of all. They still carried kindness, but it was a different kind now, sharper and stronger, the kind that doesn't yield to cruelty. Chuck had stayed longer than planned. What was meant to be a short visit stretched into months. He taught classes at the community center, trained young officers and high school students in self-defense, and spoke at local gatherings about integrity and accountability. At first, he refused the invitations, insisting he wasn't a preacher or politician. But people didn't want sermons from him. They wanted stories. They wanted to hear about how strength could live quietly inside a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. One cold December evening after closing time, Helen stood wiping down the counter while Chuck sat at a booth near the window, sipping coffee. The diner was empty except for the low hum of the jukebox playing an old Willie Nelson tune. The light from the street lamps outside spilled across the floor in long golden bands. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but clear. Chuck looked up from his cup. "Leaving? Going back to your place, your life? You've been here too long, Chuck. I can't keep you grounded forever." He smiled. "You're not keeping me grounded, Mom. You're reminding me why I started walking in the first place." She chuckled softly. "You always had a way of turning simple things into poetry." "Guess I got that from you." She shook her head. "No, you got that from your father. I just gave you the coffee." They shared a quiet laugh. The sound was warm, familiar. For a moment it felt as though the years had folded back to when he was a young boy helping her wipe tables after school. He had always been protective, even then standing between her and rude customers, insisting on carrying heavy boxes, watching the road until her husband's truck came home. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves along the pavement. Helen glanced out the window and saw a patrol car parked across the street. For a brief second, her body tensed, but then she noticed the new uniforms, different men, different eyes. The department had changed almost completely since the trial. The sheriff had retired early, replaced by a woman named Carla Jensen, who had made it her mission to rebuild trust. Her officers were younger, humbler, trained differently. Sometimes they came into the diner for coffee, removing their hats before they entered, greeting Helen with genuine respect. The first time that happened, she'd felt tears in her eyes. Chuck followed her gaze toward the window. "You still watching the doors?" he said quietly. "Old habits die hard." "They don't have to," he replied. "Being careful isn't the same as being afraid." She nodded. "I know." For a long moment they sat in companionable silence, listening to the faint crackle of the jukebox. Then Helen spoke again, her tone more reflective. "Do you ever think about forgiveness, Chuck? About what it really means?" He looked down at his cup, swirling the coffee slowly. "Every day," he said, "I've seen men lose themselves because they couldn't forgive. It doesn't mean forgetting. It just means refusing to carry the weight of someone else's sin forever." She sighed softly. "I've tried to forgive them. Sometimes I think I have. Other times, you're human," he said gently. "Forgiveness isn't a door. It's a road. You walk it a little every day." She smiled faintly. "You really did get that poetry from your father." The next morning brought frost on the diner's windows. Helen arrived early as usual, her breath misting in the air, her hands tucked into worn leather gloves. She unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and started the first pot of coffee. The bell above the door jingled, and for a brief instant, the sound still sent a shiver through her, an echo of fear from months ago, but it passed quickly. The first customer of the day was a young police officer in his 20s. He removed his hat and greeted her shyly. "Morning, Mrs. Norris. Sheriff Jensen sent me to check if your new security system's working right." She smiled kindly. "It's working fine, but I appreciate you stopping by." He nodded, hesitated, then said, "My mom told me what you did. She said you reminded her that silence helps the wrong people." Helen blinked, surprised. "That's a kind thing for her to say." "She wanted me to thank you." He hesitated, then added quietly, You made me want to wear this uniform better than the last ones did. For a moment, Helen couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat tight. Then maybe something good really did come from all that mess. After he left, she stood at the window watching him cross the street. Snow began to fall lightly, coating the road in pale dust. The town looked softer somehow, wrapped in stillness. The past still lived here, but it no longer ruled. By Christmas, the diner had become a gathering place again, not for speeches or journalists, but for families, old friends, laughter. On Christmas Eve, Helen hosted a dinner for the community. People filled every booth and table. Sheriff Jensen brought her 2 children. Joe Harkins arrived with his wife and grandchildren. The jukebox played holiday songs, and the scent of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. Chuck stood behind the counter, helping serve plates of pie. Someone toasted to new beginnings, and everyone raised their glasses, including Helen. When the night wound down, she stepped outside for a breath of cold air. The street was quiet, the stars sharp against the dark sky. The air smelled of pine and frost. Chuck joined her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Still your best brew," he said, handing her one. She smiled, taking it. "Still my favorite customer." They stood there for a while, watching the lights flicker from the windows of the diner. "You know," she said softly, "when all this started, I thought I'd lost everything that made me who I was. My hair, my pride, my peace. But I was wrong. I just forgot that those things don't live on the outside." Chuck looked at her, his expression calm, full of respect. "You didn't lose anything, Mom. You reminded everyone else what they'd forgotten." She glanced at him with a faint smile. "You always did know how to make a woman feel 10 feet tall. I just tell the truth." In the months that followed, the diner's name became almost legendary, though Helen never let it turn into a museum. She refused to sell merchandise or allow tourist banners. "This place isn't about fame," she would say. "It's about mornings." And indeed, the mornings returned to what they had always been, warm, steady, full of small kindnesses. Truckers came for coffee, school teachers stopped in before class, and young officers came in groups, sometimes leaving extra tips with quiet gratitude. The bell above the door no longer sounded like warning. It sounded like life. One afternoon, when spring came again, Helen found a letter waiting by the door. It had no return address. Inside was a simple piece of paper with neat handwriting. "Mrs. Norris, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I think about what I did every day. I'm trying to be a better man. Maybe someday I'll earn the right to apologize in person. R." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. Later that evening, she burned it in the kitchen stove, watching the flame curl the edges of the paper before it turned to ash. She felt no hatred, only release. That night she dreamt of her husband again, standing in the old diner kitchen, laughing as he flipped pancakes, the morning sun spilling through the window. She saw Chuck as a boy, sitting on the counter swinging his legs, waiting for his father to hand him the first plate. When she woke, the dream stayed with her, not as sorrow but as warmth. Years later, when the diner finally passed into Chuck's care, he kept everything exactly as it was. The red booths, the checkered floor, even the old jukebox that still played Patsy Cline when the mornings were quiet. On one wall hung a framed black and white photograph of Helen, taken not by any reporter, but by a local photographer who had captured her one ordinary morning, standing by the window with her coffee, sunlight tracing her silver hair. Beneath it, a brass plaque read simply, "She stood her ground." The world moved on, as it always does. But in that small Texas town, the story of Helen Norris became part of the landscape retold by teachers, whispered by parents, remembered in moments when people faced injustice and found the courage to speak. And sometimes when the bell above the diner door rang in the quiet of early morning, those who knew the story would look up from their coffee, smile faintly, and feel, just for a moment, that peace could be something earned and kept. On one such morning, as sunlight broke across the plains, Chuck stood by the counter pouring coffee for a stranger who'd stopped on his way through town. The man looked around at the photographs on the wall and asked, "Was she really as strong as they say?" Chuck smiled and glanced toward the framed picture. "Stronger," he said simply. She never had to raise her voice to make the world listen. Outside, the wind rustled through the open fields, carrying with it the scent of coffee, warmth, and something like remembrance. And in that gentle wind, if one listened closely enough, there seemed to be the faintest sound of a bell ringing, a quiet, eternal echo of the day Helen Norris had taught the world that dignity, once found, never truly fades. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe for more true-to-life stories that hit hard. Watch the next video right now and share this one so more people can see what real courage looks like.